Hi, you guys. Mrs. Kirchhoff here. Now that you've read the story The Sniper, let's take a closer look at some of the story elements that we've studied already and how they play out in this story. So let's start with the characters. We have a very small amount of characters, very few characters in this story, but let's start with the protagonist. So if you remember, the protagonist of a story is the main character working towards a goal. So in this case, our main character or protagonist would be the IRA sniper or the Republican sniper. So we don't have a name for him. We'll talk about what character type he is in a minute, but he is considered our protagonist. The antagonist of a story is the villain or the character working against the protagonist and trying to stop him or her from reaching his or her goals. So our protagonist is the sniper across the street. So the sniper across the street is trying to kill our protagonist. Let's move on to plot diagram. So if you remember down here at the bottom, we start with exposition. So that's where we learn who our characters are, as well as establishing the setting. Then we move into the rising action of a story. So this is events that are complicating the plot and creating problems for the main character as he or she tries to reach a goal. At the top, this is where we see the climax. So the climax is the point of most excitement in the story. It's a turning point in the story where things start to change for the main character, the protagonist. From here, we go into the falling action. So these are events that are a result of the climax. And then the resolution is how does the story wrap up? How do things end? So in this case, our exposition, we learn there are two opposing snipers on opposite buildings. We're never told directly that the story takes place in Dublin, Ireland in the 1920s. That's some background information that I gave you based on research about this author and his experiences. But for our baseline in our exposition, we've learned two opposing snipers, they're on rooftops of buildings. So our first rising action event, if you remember, when the sniper, after he's done eating his sandwich, he really wants to smoke and he's debating, should I risk lighting the cigarette because then anybody will be able to see me because of the ember or not? And so he goes ahead and he does it and he ends up revealing his position to the opposing sniper. So next we have that armored car that comes down the road and an old lady goes over to the car and she's informing them of our snipers, the protagonist location. So as a result, our sniper takes her out. So he shoots the old lady. That's a rising action event. And then the IRA sniper himself is shot. So that's our final rising action event before the climax. This is where the IRA sniper tricks the enemy sniper and then he ends up shooting him as a result. So if you remember, he pretended like he got shot, right? He had his hat balanced on the end of his gun. He had the hat and the rifle fall down to the street. So he pretended like he was dead. He'd been hit. And that caused the enemy sniper to be off his guard. And our IRA sniper was able to kill him and take him out. So as a result of that, the following action is that the protagonist feels sick and he feels disgusted by war. So he starts to have all these feelings of doubt and guilt in himself after he shoots the enemy sniper. But he ends up pulling himself together and he manages to escape the building's rooftop because he is injured and he needs to go have that looked at. So the final end result of this story, the resolution of the story, is that twist at the end when the protagonist finds out the enemy sniper was actually his brother. And this is why that context, that historical background we went over earlier in the week is so important. We talked about how in this Irish Civil War, families were split apart and soldiers that had been fighting together on the same site got split into two different sides. And so once we read that at the end, we realize that must have happened to our protagonist as well. His brother, we didn't know he had a brother. Now we've learned his brother was on the enemy side, and in a twist of fate, he's shot and killed his brother. So let's go a little bit deeper into the conflict of this story. So we have examples of external conflict. So if you remember, that's a conflict that exists between a character and an outside force, and we have different types of external conflict. So in this case, we have character versus character. The IRA sniper is trying to kill the enemy sniper on the opposite rooftop. So here's a quote that supports that from the text. The enemy on the opposite roof covered his escape. He must kill the enemy, and he could not use his rifle. He had only a revolver to do it. Then he thought of a plan. So this quote is showing our Republican sniper, our protagonist, in the process trying to think of ways to kill the enemy. We also have some internal conflict in this story. So if you remember, internal conflict is when a character struggles with something. So it could be a struggle with a decision. It could be a doubt or feelings of guilt that a character has. And if you remember, after the protagonist kills the enemy, he feels really guilty. He feels sick to his stomach. He's cursing himself, cursing the war. And I actually have that as a quote here. So it says in the text, the sniper looked at his falling enemy and shuddered. The lust of battle died in him. He became bitten by remorse. He began to gibber to himself, cursing the war, cursing himself, cursing everybody. So this is not initially how the sniper, the main character, seemed to feel at the beginning of the story, but he's definitely struggling with guilt after he kills his enemy. Let's talk about characterization. So we spent time on characterization with the story Thank You, Ma'am. Let's revisit it now. So we know that direct characterization is when the author tells us directly some information about the character in the story. It'll say, the character is this, the character is that. So I've got a quote here. His face was the face of a student, thin and acidic, but his eyes had the cold gleam of the fanatic. They were deep and thoughtful, the eyes of a man who is used to looking at death. So this quote is telling us that the protagonist has the face of a student. So that's telling me he's probably on the younger side, right? Maybe 16, 18. I'm assuming he's not in college or anything like that. So if he's being referred to as a student, he's probably an older teenager. We know his body type, he's thin, and he has a gleam in his eye, and the author tells us it's because he's used to looking at death, and I apologize for my typo error there. He's used to looking at death. So those are things that the author is directly telling us in the text about our main character. Here's another quote that's an example of direct characterization. His teeth chattered. He began to gibber to himself, cursing the war, cursing himself, cursing everybody. So this is telling us directly an action that the main character is doing. So what he's saying, what he is doing, describing the character. We also have some indirect characterization in the story as well. Take a look at this quote and think about what it tells us about our protagonist. The woman darted towards the side street. The sniper fired again. The woman whirled around and fell with a sudden shriek into the gutter. So this quote is telling us that indirectly that the sniper does not hesitate to shoot the enemy, even if that enemy is a woman, right? This woman is not a soldier; she's an informant. So she's not armed, but she is telling people that have weapons his location. And so he does not hesitate to take her out. So this is telling us that he is not afraid to take action and that he does not worry about, the fact that she's a woman and unarmed. So he's doing whatever it takes to protect himself. All right, character type. So we talked about dynamic and static characters. Dynamic character is a character that changes through the course of a story. A static character stays the same. So I would argue that the protagonist is a dynamic character because at the beginning of the story, he seems pretty used to, the way of life. He's seen death before. He's, knows what he has to do. He does it. He takes out the old woman, right? Doesn't feel anything. And then he takes out the enemy sniper and he feels regret and remorse. He feels guilty. So this is a quote. The sniper looked at his enemy falling and shuddered. The lust of battle died in him. He became bitten by remorse. So this is a change that we see in him. The other deaths, he'd actually killed 2 people before this, and we didn't see this reaction from him. And for whatever reason now, after he shoots the enemy sniper, his feelings change and he feels guilty and he feels sick. Flat or round characters. So flat characters are characters we don't know a whole lot about, whereas round characters are characters that we know a lot about them and we know about their personalities and their personality traits. So I would say most of the characters in these stories are flat. The enemy sniper is definitely flat. The woman and the people that were in that armored car are all flat characters. The protagonist, you could make a case for him being a flat character or a round character. We definitely know more about him than we do the other characters, but we don't know a lot about him. We don't know much of his background or history outside of war. So you could make a case and argue either of these. I would argue that he's a round character, especially since we know more about him than the other characters. And his character type is revealed through a lot of his actions and his thoughts. There's not a lot of dialogue in this story, but it's revealed in other ways. So that's our brief discussion on the story elements we've seen so far in The Sniper. Please make sure you submit this assignment, and I look forward to talking to you soon. Have a great day.